And cool. I believe we've already also started recording. So first of all, I am Pooja. I wanted to do a quick walkthrough of our agenda. We'll do a quick speaker intro, tell you a bit about who I am, why I'm doing this, and we'll then dive into why we are designing a chat application and definitely get into more of the fun nitty-gritty details of how we actually design the system. A little bit about myself. I've really enjoyed working at mission-oriented companies. Also, for the next few slides, a lot of this content I've kind of repeated in the previous sessions. I generally try to do like a quick run through because there might be folks who are here for the very first time. So I want to make sure that they are getting all the background and context for this specific session. And so previously, I've been at Slack, Digit, Qventus, which are all healthcare fintech startups. My motto, which I really like, is lift as we climb, because I strongly believe that we can do so much by helping everyone around us. And next up, I wanted to kind of, talk through who this meetup is for. In the participant group, there might be folks who essentially fit into the different categories, but this meetup is super helpful for someone who's preparing for interviews. One of the things that, if if you're currently interviewing or have previously attended various, interviews, is this system design ends up being like a pretty critical interview when you are attending software engineering interviews. In fact, soft system design is actually one of the main interview slots through which leveling is decided, especially for software engineering. So it's super important that you make a great impression and are also getting the job that you rightfully deserve. This is also becoming a pretty big component of engineering management interviews, and sometimes you can also see this pop up in technical product or project manager interviews. The series can also be helpful for folks who are keen on building on system design skill set, who are early in their career, or just want to expand on knowledge on different types of challenges. And before we dive into the system design itself, one of the things that I always like to share with folks is a system design interview blueprint. I cannot stress this enough. I have seen many interviewees who jump into problem-solving mode without actually understanding the problem enough. And then halfway down the road, they realize that they have many questions, and then you end up designing a solution which was absolutely not what the interviewer had in mind. So it's super essential that you kind of have like a rough blueprint of how you would be tackling this interview. So starting off with, understanding and defining scope, that you're breaking down into functional and non-functional requirements. You are then getting into plan and getting buy-in from the interviewer, because you want to make sure that you're actually solving the problem that the interviewer essentially has set out for you. And then eventually you get into the deep dive phase. The deep dive phase can also vary based on the type of the problem itself. Sometimes it can go into the algorithm section. The first session of the system design series, we actually did a deep dive on how do you generate unique identifiers. So it was very, very highly emphasized on algorithms. Sometimes they can also take the shape of, what is the data flow going to look like? And then what's also super important is to highlight the why, what, and how of how you're thinking through the trade-offs. And then eventually you want to make sure that you are actually summarizing the problem that the solution that you just proposed. And I also want to add a huge disclaimer that there is no one-size-fits-all approach in system design. The sooner you embrace it, it gets better in your preparation. It's essentially an avenue where your background gets to shine. If you think about it, you have 1 hour to impress the interviewer. And quite often, system design may involve designing really complex applications which you've used in your life. and you kind of are expected to build in an hour. Most of the times, interviewers are really good about scoping the question so it fits into the 1 hour. But it's super important to keep in mind that there's a lot that you can talk about in that 1 hour. There's no one perfect solution, as I mentioned. There are many ways of designing a system. And this is the number one suggestion that I give everyone: leverage your background. Each one of you here, are subject matter expert in different parts of the application stack. There might be folks who are really skilled at front end, some folks who are really skilled at data modeling, some folks are really skilled at, writing APIs. Some folks are, just awesome at infrastructure. So think about what are the areas in your background that you can actually showcase in the interview, because ultimately the interviewer is actually curious to learn about, you know, the type of problems that you have worked in the past and how you're leveraging your background in solving the problems that are being presented to you in the interview. You'll also hear a lot of names of products. These are also just references. By no means, what we talk about is how these products are designed. Parts of it maybe, but what happens under the hood is a lot more complicated than what can fit in the 1 hour that we have. And one thing I'll also highlight is I definitely want you to go back to the first principles, because sometimes just asking and understanding how things work from the ground up is actually not a bad thing. Cool. Before we dive deep in, I also like to make sure that this type of kind of discussion is actually a place where folks can actually stop and ask questions. Nobody, hates a dull and boring presentation as much as I do. So I'll make sure to pause, ask, give some time for folks to ask questions. We'll keep it super interactive, and all of your interactions, feel free to leverage the Zoom chat. Whenever you have any questions, just drop a question onto the Zoom chat, and I'll try my best to answer those questions as they come about. Cool. And why did we choose this topic? So one of the main reasons why we chose this topic is chat application is pretty embedded in our day-to-day life. I downloaded this image from the internet where it talked about all the different types of chat applications. Some of these may already, cease to exist. However, there's still many applications in here which we actually interact with on a day-to-day basis. So this is pretty core to how we, communicate with each other. And there's a lot of, interesting technical challenges under the hood of how these applications actually work, how different components work, how interactions work. So there's definitely a good kind of example to dive into system design in general. Additionally, this is also something which was one of the very top requested topic from the previous sessions. There's many interesting nuances when you're thinking about designing a chat app, thinking of, there's the nature of interactions. There's a lot of different edge cases. There's also a lot of distinct features that you can develop, just throwing some names out there. The way WhatsApp works is very different compared to how, let's say, an application such as Slack works, or another application such as Facebook Messenger. So there's a lot of different nuances around chat applications. And as part of your interview, let's say you're presented with that problem, there's different ways and different, areas the interview can essentially shape into. Cool. Having given you all the context, let's actually jump into building something. So you are essentially presented with a problem to, hey, let's design a chat application together. I cannot stress this enough. As I mentioned to you before, stop before you jump into problem solving. Make sure you really understand what the interviewer wants you to solve. And most importantly, what is the interviewer interested to learn from you? And let's actually step back and look into the blueprint. As per our blueprint, the first phase is essentially understanding and defining scope. So let's say you're presented with this problem of, let's design a chat application. What are some of the questions that you as an interviewee will have? And what are some things that you would, be curious about or get clarifying answers from the interviewer, feel free to drop your message in the Zoom chat. We'll wait for a minute for more folks to type in. Think through, what are the questions that you would propose? What are ways in which, you have seen chat applications work? Thank you, Michelle, for posting. Would love for more folks to participate, ask questions. Again, this is a very open forum. It's most beneficial if it's interactive, and highly encourage everyone to, hopefully you feel comfortable enough to ask questions. Awesome. So we have folks who, Michelle mentioned, are we building a chat for one-on-one or group chat? That is a great clarifying question, because as we have interacted with many chat applications in the past, you can have one-on-one interactions, you can have group interactions, you can have, interactions in the form of a channel. So there's different kind of directions that a chat applications can go. There was also a mention around, is it region specific, or, are global users expected to interact? Applications such as Facebook Messenger, you are able to interact with basically anyone around the world. In applications such as Slack, it's more kind of, specific to your organization. So there's different kind of scope involved. What kind of integration we want in terms of, IAM, that's great. Does it support anonymous users? That's great. Is the chat text only? Again, another great clarifying question. Pretty much every chat application we know has image, videos, and a lot of different kind of file types attached to it. Are the messages we send encrypted for privacy? That is great. A lot of chat applications, especially Signal, WhatsApp, they actually support end-to-end encryption, which definitely ensures the privacy of the messages that are flowing through the system. And then, do we want an internal chat system or a chatbot system? First of all, these are great clarifying questions, and thank you for everyone for asking these. These are exactly the type of questions that you should be asking. Just to kind of uh, post a snapshot of questions that potentially you can ask. All of these questions, in fact, folks have already highlighted. First of all, you want to make sure that you're understanding what is the feature subset of the application. Does it allow one-on-one or group interaction? For the purpose of the current system design, let's just assume that we only want to design for one-on-one and group interactions. What is the scale of the system like? Let's throw a constraint that the system is expected to be scalable. The system is expected to support 1 million users at the minimum. Are there any other features? One of the common feature that a lot of users see in chat applications is, when was the user last available? When was the message last seen? We can ignore for now, especially for the scope of this question. But maybe in the future, if time permits, an interviewer may ask you to actually talk through this. So a lot of folks have already asked these questions, so definitely, highly encourage folks to, take a pause, think through, and make sure that you really understand the scope of what you're trying to solve. Quite often, what I've found helpful is literally writing down a list of functional and non-functional requirements. So that way, the interviewer and you are literally on the same page on what the actual requirements of the system will be that you're trying to build right now. Cool. And let's actually go back to the first principle. So we want to build a chat application, and at a very, very high level, a chat application, essentially what it's doing is user X is able to send messages to user Y. The server here is essentially, it's sending messages, receiving messages for other clients. Sometimes the server is also expected to store the messages if the user especially is not available. And in a way, the users are essentially interacting with each other via HTTP. And one thing that you would, maybe raise is, hey, but HTTP is client initiated. How does the user Y actually get to know that this new message is available for its consumption? And that's actually a great question to actually dive in and then talk to your interviewer about, hey, you know what? I think it's super important to actually understand what is the actual protocol that we will be using for this, user-to-user interaction or chat application interaction that we essentially want to build. Now, what I'm going to talk in the next few slides, kind of go back to that first principles approach where we then talk through how that interaction is accomplished and what is the type of protocol that we eventually want to use. I kind of added this slide so it gives you like a flavor of what the interviewer might be interested to know about. So one approach to making this happen is having like a simple, polling where, let's say user Y is asking the server, hey, are there any new messages that are available for me? And the server may respond with either, nope, there's nothing for you, or it may respond with, yes, there's few messages that are available for you. Now, when you think about this type of interaction, as you can imagine, there's a lot of wasted server resources, especially when the user may not really be interacting. This is a lot of HTTP connections that are essentially opening and closing, which is definitely a lot of resources that are wasted on the server side. And keep in mind, the number of users that are expected to be on the system is 1 million users. So having a system where you're constantly, opening, closing, polling may not really be very efficient when it comes to server resources. So definitely not an approach that works for our requirement. Next up, another approach that you can often see is long polling. It's a little bit better than polling. The way this works is the user essentially keeps the connection open for a little longer. Usually these connections are essentially open for a specific time. And as soon as the timeout hits, the connection essentially gets closed. So in this case, as long as the connection is open, the user is essentially, polling the server and asking, hey, are there any new messages available for me? And as soon as new messages are available, the server is sending back messages and then the connection gets closed. And then the user is essentially is kickstarting this process all over again. Now, the advantage is, yes, there's no like constant connection open and close that is happening compared to polling, but still there's a lot of long-lived HTTP connections, especially when users are not really active for a long time. So while this helps a little bit, it's still not something that would work for the scale of users that we essentially want to support. And next up, another approach or protocol that actually works is actually using a WebSocket. The way WebSocket essentially works is it's also something that's initiated by a client, but WebSockets are bidirectional and they're also persistent. Most of the WebSockets essentially start off as a HTTP. They also run on port 80 and 443, which are essentially HTTP, HTTPS. So the way this would work is user X would, set up like a handshake, get acknowledgement, and then they would be able to exchange bidirectional messages through a WebSocket. Now, when you think about it, this is definitely a lot more scalable and works better for the purpose that we essentially want for the chat application. So this is something that we would use as a protocol for our chat application. Cool. And one of the big feedbacks that we got from the previous sessions is, hey, what if we could actually talk about data modeling as part of our system design question? So hopefully we can talk through the different nuances of data modeling as part of this example. How do we store all of this data? Now, if you think about a chat application, there's users, there's groups, there's messages. So let's actually think through structure or kind of like a framework of how we actually want to, store all of this data. At this point, I want to encourage you to don't actually get into the details of, is it a MySQL? Is it like a relational DB, non-relational DB? I don't think it's super important in the beginning. Eventually, it gets important. But what's important is actually breaking down the complexity and outlining what is the data model that your application will essentially have. So let's actually go into some of the details. So at a very high level, your application has users. So your table, which is your user table, can have a field such as ID, which is like a unique identifier. You can also have field names such as first name, last name. Another thing to keep in mind is, ID can also be long text as you need, because sometimes integers are not really scalable, especially for the type of application that you want to support. For the purpose here, since it's just 1 million users, it's probably not the worst. Um, However, there's also aspects where the interviewer may ask you to, hey, talk about how you would generate these IDs. So if you want to learn about unique ID generation, our first session actually covered that topic. So I highly recommend you to kind of go back to that first session and just walk through how that unique ID generation can happen. Additionally, sometimes it's also worth talking about another table called as user profile. Quite often, you want to abstract away some of the fields which are probably not important for the user. Let's say you want to store things such as email, phone, address, or location, time zone. There's so many other things that your chat application may want to track. For example, within Slack, you can actually set what time zone you are in. So that way, let's say someone is messaging you, it'll tell you, oh, you know what? This is actually not a time zone where Pooja might be available. So it kind of helps to talk through how you would think through all of those, data models or scenarios. Again, not the most useful for this question, but sometimes it's helpful to kind of talk through some of those additional edge cases, because at the end of the day, you want to make a good impression, and telling the interviewer that you're thinking about these things is definitely very helpful. Cool. So now we know what the user model is going to look like. Let's actually dive into the group model. So we talked about, one-on-one interaction. We talked about being able to have group interactions. So a group table can have, again, an identifier, which is unique to the group. You can also have like a name. Let's say you want to name your group as something, then you can have that. You can also have the type of the group. Keep in mind, this is one way of designing the data model. There's many other ways, but for my purpose, I kind of choose this design because it kind of keeps the one-on-one and group interaction pretty lean and also pretty neat. So let's say this is a one-on-one interaction, then type can be one-on-one. Let's say this is a group interaction, then this can be like the type can be essentially group. So next up, you also want to track, especially for a group membership, hey, who are the users who are actually part of a group? So it can be as simple as, you have your unique identifier for the membership. You can then have a user ID, which is a foreign key to the user. You can then have a group ID, which is essentially a foreign key. Sorry for the typo here. This was actually meant to be foreign key group. Clearly, I just copy pasted, which was my bad. So group ID here refers to the foreign key group essentially. Cool. And then most importantly, you also want to make sure that you're able to store the messages that are going out. So you can have like a group ID, which is essentially a foreign key of the group. You also want to track which user actually sent this message. So the sender ID takes care of that, the message text, and also like a timestamp of when this message was sent. So this model kind of outlines and covers both one-on-one as well as group interactions. And let's actually put this data model to use. What's a database without data? So let's actually add some data into it and see how this will actually work. So for the purpose of this question, we have two users, user X and then user Y. They would essentially have those two entries within your user table. You'll then have, let's say, again, this is just the one-on-one messaging, by the way. For the group, you would essentially have, an ID and then type, DM, that's the enum I ended up choosing. Keep in mind, this name is not necessarily useful or important for the one-on-one interaction, but sometimes you can either, just leave it empty or just prefix or just populate a name which is system generated. Not a big deal, but something worth kind of calling out. And then for the group membership, you have the ID, you have user ID 1, group ID, and then all of that. And then you have a message table where you're tracking what group was this message sent to, which user actually sent this message, and then what is the message that this user sent, and then what is the timestamp that this user actually sent this message. So a lot of, this is just one-on-one interaction, and you can kind of similarly map that to a group interaction as well. I'll pause and see if there's any questions of the data model so far. All right. I'm going to assume this is super straightforward, which is great to hear. In which case, I think we can go ahead. Feel free to drop any questions, even if later, and I'll make sure to address those questions. Cool. And another thing to keep in mind is in a lot of system design interviews, it can take a lot of different directions. More often than not, the interviewer will ask you a lot of follow-up questions. They may ask you things such as, hey, how will you adapt your data model to track, let's say, if a message was seen by a user? Let's say they can also say, hey, how do you allow only specific users to update group membership? How do you allow images and messages? How do you actually update your data model to actually incorporate images in your messages? Because if you look back into our message model, right now we are actually just tracking the text message. We never mentioned anything about image or video or basically anything else. So that's something that may come up as a follow-up kind of question to the initial scope. Additionally, there's essentially a lot of ways in which the interview can evolve, and the interviewer may further probe in any of the above directions. So make sure that as you're thinking through the data model, you're also making changes based on whatever scope that is introduced later as part of your interview. Cool. And next up, I wanted to kind of give a very high level system design. So this is a lot, so I'll try to break it down into what this interaction essentially looks like. So at a very high level, what we have here is you have a user, and then in the middle box, you essentially see a bunch of services that are interacting amidst the different components. So I'll actually break down the services first. So let's start with a web service. So web service is essentially a collection of HTTP servers. So the main purpose of this web service is it's actually able to interact with the user and talk about, when are the users actually logging into the system? When are the users actually, let's say the users are doing any profile updates. None of those don't necessarily need to actually go through, um, you know, go through like a WebSocket service. They can actually just take the usual route of HTTP. And then the second service that you see is actually the WebSocket service. We talked about why we need why we need WebSockets. So this service is essentially responsible for generating these WebSockets, making sure that clients are connected to the right WebSockets, and every client is essentially able to continue along the interactions as it initially planned to. One more thing that that is that I should have updated here is this present service. So this present service is actually should be connected to the WebSocket service, because the present service, what it essentially does is it's actually tracking if the user is available or not. It's important to have it as a dedicated service, because you want to decouple that from the WebSocket service and make sure that it's part of another service whose main job is making sure checking up on the clients that are connecting to your web application. I see a question. Yeah, so there was a question around, can you provide a technical solution for viewing, that is, who has seen the message like in WhatsApp? Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to do a little bit of live editing. So let's actually do that. So give me a quick second. Can you folks still see my screen? Cool. Let me just put up a new slide. So data model, last seen. So Arpita essentially asked, how do you actually adapt this data model to track when a message was last seen by the user? So let me see how I can easily track. Okay, actually we'll just use the table. So in the previously we only had 4 different models. You had user, group membership, and message. To track when a message was seen by a user or last seen by the user, doesn't matter. You essentially want to have pretty much like a new table rather than attaching to the existing table, because it's a very different scope in general. So let's see how we can make that happen. So I'm just going to add a table in here. So field type. So what we essentially want to do is this. Now, user A sent a message, let's say hello world, to a group, which consists of 5 different users. Now, each of those users, of course, will see these messages at very different times. So as part of our extension, we want to track if a specific user within the group has actually seen this message or not. So in this last seen table, what we can do is, let's just throw in like a unique identifier. I'm just going to add a bunch of new rows. Bear with me as I do live editing. Okay. So what do we actually want to track? So we have a message ID, and this would essentially be a foreign key to the message table. And then we want to track which of those users essentially actually saw the message. So you want to have a way to track user ID, let's say what user we are actually talking about, and then last seen, this will be like a, let's do timestamp, so this will be a date time. So the way this would work is, let me see how I can make this happen. So yeah, so this is actually a fairly straightforward implementation. So we would add a new table, which would track what is the message, what is the user that actually has seen this message, and what time did they use this message. So let's say you open up your chat application, you want to see which users have actually used this message. You would then do something like, let me do textbooks. So you would do something like select star from last seen table where message ID equal to, whatever is the message ID. That's pretty much it. So when you do this, it's going to tell you, it'll give you like a bunch of rows, and only the users that have actually seen this message would have an entry in here. And then you can show, oh, this user saw this message at 10 p.m. Rest of the users didn't really see, so you can just leave it empty. So hopefully this provides a bit of clarity. Arpita, feel free to post any other clarifying questions. Does this look good? Awesome, cool. All right, thank you for bearing with my live editing. I'm not very good when it comes to live editing. Cool, so let's actually go back to our high-level system design. So we talked about the present service. As I mentioned, this was an editing mistake. I should have connected the present service to here. So the present service is actually talking to the WebSocket service, because this is also something that we want to have potentially bidirectional. One thing that you'll keep in mind that I want to highlight is, as you can see, we have both HTTP and WebSockets. You can say, hey, why not do everything through WebSocket? You kind of can, but we don't want to. For a lot of things which don't require a WebSocket, we still want to continue to use HTTP. And we also want to have like a database where you can persist a lot of this data. One cool thing that I want to share is when a message is sent in an application such as Slack, that message actually gets sent as a HTTP call as well as a WebSocket. So what that ensures is the HTTP call ensures that that message gets written to the database, and the WebSocket essentially ensures that it's actually propagated to the right clients who it's intended to. So that ensures that there's a little bit of reliability and availability of that sending of messages. So that's one approach that you can also potentially use. So let's actually do like a flow diagram of this. A user, when they log in or join a group, leave a group, when there's profile updates, they would essentially contact the web service, because for the most part, all of this can be handled through a simple HTTP call. This HTTP service would essentially, write into the database, fairly straightforward. Now, let's say the user is actually sending messages. So when it comes to sending messages, it would essentially interact with the WebSocket service, and the WebSocket service will actually take care of, sending messages, relaying messages. It can also, read and write to the database. So that's something that the WebSocket service is essentially doing. Another concept that I didn't know if we'll have time to go into the details is the concept of service discovery. So a lot of users essentially, service discovery is a process through which users figure out what server they can contact for, for their continued interaction. So that's something that, having like a WebSocket service can essentially also interact with. So I'll pause and see if there's any questions on the high-level system design. All right, no questions. Some follow-up questions that you can essentially anticipate, which I didn't really actually cover as part of this discussion, is sometimes the interviewer may also ask you, hey, how would you introduce push notifications for your applications? In which case, you want to take the system design and see how push notifications can be accomplished. They can also ask you questions around how will multiple devices be supported? Can you tell me how you would keep things in sync? This is something that we touched into, which is type of database. Eventually, as part of your system design, you also want to talk through what type of database you would use. You can actually, just use a MySQL for your chat application. Believe it or not, Slack actually uses MySQL for its application. They also have a more distributed MySQL through Vitess, but for the most part, MySQL is also pretty viable option for a chat application. A lot of other chat applications go the NoSQL route, where they may use like a key value store when they're choosing a database for the application. So again, no right or wrong answers. All you want to do is leverage your background, talk through the trade-offs, talk about where the system may perform well, where the system will fail. That's essentially what makes the crux of the system design or the deep dive in general. So yeah, so that's about the system design discussion that we essentially wanted to do. Again, as I mentioned, there's many different ways that this can evolve, which unfortunately we'll not be able to cover as part of this session, but highly recommend folks to take a look at this follow-up and learn about how this can be accommodated. And I also wanted to share a few references if you're someone who is actively preparing for interviews. These are resources that I've personally used and found some benefit in. And then that's pretty much it. I will pause and see if folks have any questions that I can answer. Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that this was useful. Cool. As we are waiting for folks to ask questions, what would you like to see in the next session? Some of the suggestions that I've heard from folks previously is, system design of a newsfeed system. How does nearby or proximity service work? How do you design a payment system? Are there any other topics that folks are interested to learn more about? I'll keep it on for a minute for some more folks have a chance to drop their suggestions. Awesome. A secure payment system, LLM design. Oh, great clarifying question, Akansha. So the back of the envelope calculations, I'll be honest, this varies based on the type of company that you're interviewing for. A lot of startups, what I've generally found is they're generally not really, again, maybe this is too general. I would say again, it's very dependent on the type of company. Let's say it's a company where they have seen, problems at scale. Some engineers are generally very interested to understand the back of the envelope calculations. Additionally, I would say, let's say you're interviewing for a senior staff positions, then back of the envelope calculations are kind of actually very important because they want to understand how you're thinking about memory, how you're thinking about system resources, how you're thinking about storage. So kind of like, the higher the level, the more detail they want to know that you're able to kind of carry forward a conversation. So I would say if it's for a earlier in the career positions, probably not as much. For the later levels, definitely super useful. Again, if it's something that you're very comfortable with, you should absolutely bring it up. More often than not, I have seen interviewers just brush it off and say, okay, this is cool, let's go ahead. So it depends. I don't think there's like a super straightforward way. Propose few numbers. If the interviewer is very interested to learn more, then only then kind of dive deeper into it. But yeah, great question. Definitely not something I added as part of the breakdown here. All right, and then session on monolith versus microservices. Yeah, so there was a question on will the newsfeed system cover following, follower, interaction? It absolutely will, because at the core of it, the newsfeed system is able to synthesize messages that are useful for a user. So we will definitely talk about it's super important to talk about that following follower interaction essentially. Cool. And then a session discussing trade-offs of different types of databases. Absolutely. Uh, This is definitely something I feel like is very, very subjective because there's so many types of databases, but I do see the benefit of doing a session such as that. Additionally, if you missed, Akansha actually shared a very useful resource. Akansha, would you be able to share that message again in the group chat? Awesome. So she'll be sharing a resource which I highly recommend to take a look because it kind of gives you like a way to digest this information at your own pace. System design 101 sessions. I'm assuming what you mean is talking about specific concepts. I don't believe we have anything planned right now, but we can put it in the hopper for things to consider in the future. Algorithmic interview, absolutely. Low-level system design. I'm assuming this is kind of going into kind of like a different layer. I would say it really varies on the type of the interview that you're doing. If the job role requires that, then definitely it can take that shape. But for the most part, let's say you're, interviewing for application design, designing, general software developer roles, then I think you may not have to worry about low-level system design. Yep, so this is part 3. So we've had 2 sessions previously. And Catherine, thank you for linking those sessions. Cool. And there was another request for mock interview. So I believe Women Who Code already provides a lot of mock interview resources. Maybe some of the other Women Who Code leaders can share. I don't remember top of my mind, but if you look up the meetup, that's definitely something that you can find as part of the meetup page itself. Catherine and Luba, if you know of any, or Akansha, if you know of any, feel free to drop a message in the Zoom chat. Because I believe there's already few sessions that exist that cover that topic. Awesome. I think we've reached the end of the messages. All right. Thank you, folks, for joining to lead this. Hopefully this was useful.